Hello, you've tuned to this week's episode of Next Steps Forward, and I'm your host, Chris Meek. As always, it's an honor to have you with us. Next Steps Forward is committed to helping others achieve more than ever while experiencing greater personal empowerment and well-being. Our special guest today is Gentry Collins. Gentry is the founder and chief executive officer of the American Free Enterprise Chamber of Commerce, a national advocacy and trade association working to expand equal economic opportunity for all Americans and to ensure that small and medium-sized businesses have fair access to the marketplace. Gentry is also partner at CAP Public Affairs, where he's worked across multiple sectors of the American economy on large-scale advocacy and brand management efforts. He served as a fellow at the University of Southern California's Center for the Political Future, lecturing on the future of the Republican Party, and he's a co-founder of newrepublican.org, created to rethink how political organizations understand brand and message. Earlier in his career, Gentry served as National Political Director of the Republican National Committee, helping return a Republican majority to Congress, and previously held senior leadership roles with the Republican Governors Association and the Republican Party of Iowa. He's been named Politico's top presidential staffer to get, and the New York Post has called him, quote, one of the most highly regarded operatives in the party. Gentry Collins, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Chris Meek, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to join you today.
No, it's an honor to have you. And those are some pretty high accolades coming from Politico and the New York Post. And so we don't often talk politics on the show, but we'll see where that message takes us today.
Sounds good.
So I mentioned in your intro, you've worked at the highest levels of politics, advocacy, and brand strategy. Before we get into policy or economics, I'd love to start personally. What originally drew you to public service and political work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think like many people, I was drawn to it, Chris, by a desire to make people's lives better. And, these days, I think people look at folks engaged in politics and they're not sure they're accomplishing that mission. So we'll let others be the judge of that. But I think I've worked with Republicans over the years, of course, my party. I've worked with a lot of senior Democrats over the years in my home state of Iowa, in Washington, D.C., and around the country. And I have to say, for all of the disagreements we have, I find that the great commonality for most of the people I've met that have an interest in working in politics is exactly that they love the country, they love our people, they want to make people's lives better, put the country on a better track, and it just so happens that we have probably more disagreements today than ever about how to do that.
Well, and maybe again, we don't talk politics, but political parties aside, to your point, more disagreements than we've probably ever had. The country's more divided probably than it's ever been in its history. I've always said in the show that most of us, 80%, using that bell curve analogy, we'll agree somewhere in that gray middle area. And you're going to have the 10% on either side, the extreme right, the extreme left. They're the bully pulpit. They've got the bullhorn. They're the ones getting the messages out there. What can we do to help change that narrative from the 20% affecting the 80%?
Well, Chris, I think it's one of the reasons that I'm pleased to be on your program today. The work that you're doing about Next Steps Forward, about the stories of empowerment in the country of normal people doing extraordinary things, I think is very much the pathway forward. I think that relying on people in Washington, D.C. to make our lives better has probably been a mistake for all of us. I think Republicans and Democrats in their own ways and in different ways, unfortunately, have learned that lesson in recent years. But I think that efforts like yours to say, hey, to paraphrase a famous Democrat in modern times, the change that you want to see starts with me and starts with your listeners. And I think that that's a really important lesson that maybe we've forgotten in the last few election cycles. We've looked to Washington for too much. Now Republicans and Democrats will hear different meanings in that comment, but I think we can share that in common as Americans. And I think the kind of folks that you've had on your program and that you work with all the time, Chris, to say, I stopped complaining about it and I started doing something about it. I think that's the pathway forward for all of us.
One thing I love having shows like this is when I talk to my guests, there'll often be a little one, or I call them yogiism, that just sort of pops out. And you just quoted the famous Democrat and said that the change that you want starts with me.
Yeah, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that's Barack Obama. We are the change that we want. And again, I'm still paraphrasing, Chris, so forgive me, I don't have it precisely right. But President Obama was right about that. For all that I may disagree with him on in terms of the way that he went about trying to achieve that, that impulse, I think, is fundamentally what's made America so successful over the last 250 years, and I think something that we'd like to see more of.
And I think that's just a great takeaway in general, regardless of, I mean, has nothing to do with political affiliation, just in terms of, again, as you mentioned, the show being about self-empowerment, resiliency, leadership,
Yes.
adversity. The change that you want to see starts with me. So I just want to leave that out there for the listeners, let that kind of hang out there for a few seconds. Gentry, you've seen politics from the inside, campaigns, party leadership, national strategy. At what point did you decide that economic opportunity and free enterprise needed a dedicated voice like the American Free Enterprise Chamber?
You know, I probably made that conclusion slowly over time. I am and always have been a Republican. I've worked for the Republican Party at all levels for a very long time, over 25 years. And, you know, we've won some elections, we've lost some elections. But one of the things that I think I share as a frustration with most American voters, Chris, is that regardless of whether my party has won or my party has lost, the progress that we've all been hungry for has not materialized. And I think that's something Republicans and Democrats, again, for different reasons, but I think that's something Republicans and Democrats probably agree on. That, you know, we've worked really hard to elect people that we want, that we like, that we think we support, and then we don't see progress as quickly or as thoroughly as we would like, or at least not as durably as we would like. You know, in fact, one of the things that I had a chance while I was teaching a course at USC a few years back, had a chance to look at every election in American history, going back 250 years now, 1788, the first congressional elections. And when you look at those elections, one of the interesting things that comes out is that the volatility that we're seeing today in American politics, which is to say every cycle or every couple of cycles, at least one chamber, the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, or the presidency has changed partisan control. I think that's true. Every election cycle is now going back 20 years, with the exception of 2012. So 20 years worth of elections, ping-ponging back and forth between the two parties, not in any particular order. That what sometimes I think is easy to forget is that's not normal, historically speaking. Historically speaking, majorities and the political sentiment that kept re-electing majorities was much more stable than it is today. And that includes through the Civil War, through the Civil Rights Movement, through Vietnam, through a lot of social and cultural unrest. The country was much more stable politically in terms of those partisan changes in Congress than it has been in modern times. And I think that goes back to my answer to your last question. What convinced me that something other than campaign and election politics was needed in order to make progress? You know, it's seeing this unsatiated appetite, COVID period especially, at the time that the American Free Enterprise Chamber of Commerce was just getting started and finding its footing, that we found that there were different sets of rules. That, you know, some stores were shut down, some were not. Some operations were shut, some were not. Some were deemed to be necessary and others were not. And there didn't seem to be any particular rhyme or reason to that, other than some of the largest operations in the country were open, while others were not. Now, without getting into the COVID politics, if we needed to close, we needed to close. But if the medical science, Chris, said that we needed to close, then everybody needed to close. And if it didn't say that we needed to close, then, you know, there should have been equal access to the marketplace. And I think that what we find is that over now 34,000 small business members around the country, you know, membership in all 50 states, that one of the commonalities is that kind of rhythm has repeated itself on other issues. Where do you see people that have difficulty accessing the marketplace, either because of the way that COVID restrictions worked, or because of the way that access to federal programs works, or access to the financial services system and the funding mechanisms that you may need, and a whole variety of other issues like that we find have not been quite an even playing field over the last number of years. And so our view is that if you're to have the vitality that only free enterprise can bring, and I'd love to talk about that if we have time during the program, that why free enterprise among all of the others? I think that's a really important question for us. But if you believe that free enterprise is the way to human flourishing, as we do, then you have to have equal access to the marketplace. That the big guys on the block, so to speak, can't have special rights, special access, special privileges that you or I can't have if we come in as new market entrants.
I never thought about that. I mean, obviously, COVID feels like a lifetime ago, only 6 years, which is shocking. But there are still businesses today that shut down because of COVID that just never opened.
Well, that's true. There are some that never reopened. There are some that have not weaned themselves from some of the COVID era subsidies too, which I would suggest is another kind of problem. I think rather than relitigating what happened during COVID the last time, I think one of our objectives is to make sure that the principle that comes out of that there should be one set of rules for all of us, that the marketplace makes better decisions than the government makes for us, and that in order to allow those decisions to be the best kinds of decisions, that all of us have to have access to the marketplace, big or small. I think that's the learning that we feel is most important from the COVID period.
Well, let's layer on top of that, and let's talk about AmFree specifically.
Mm-hmm.
How's the American Free Enterprise Chamber different from traditional chambers of commerce?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think that a number of things are true. One, I think we are allied with most chambers, not competitive with them. As a relatively, we're about 5 years old now, Chris, as you may know. And the press likes to write that this new upstart chamber of commerce is here to challenge somebody else or to challenge the legacy players. We work in coordination and generally side by side with existing chambers nationally at the state and local levels on a whole variety of issues. So number one, let me just start with that. I think in terms of what makes us a little bit different is that we have had a real focus on a national membership that is comprised principally of small business members. And that has allowed us to focus on a variety of issues that I think some of our colleagues at other chambers around the country, including national chambers, perhaps gives us a little bit of a delineation. I think it also allows us to be a little more sensitive to what's happening outside the Beltway than traditional Washington, D.C. based trade organizations. We have a large footprint in Washington, but we're domiciled out in the American Midwest, in what's historically been a purple state, a first in the nation presidential state, and a place where I think we have an opportunity, not because we're smarter or better, but simply because it's the sort of the culture we're swimming in every day, so to speak. I think to have a finger really on the pulse of the needs of American small and mid-sized enterprises in a way that our colleagues that are stuck in Washington, D.C. every day and maybe are a little slower to have. That breadth of membership has also allowed us to engage in legal action around the country, and in fact around the world. We're the only American trade association that has established standing to sue in the European Union on behalf of American businesses and American free enterprise, and it is that breadth of membership that gives us the ability to have membership that is willing to bring suit when we find episodes of overregulation, that has standing to sue, and in many important cases has favorable venue, whereas our colleagues that are DC centric, have a great set of tools and are great allies on many things, but are really kind of in that one lane, and so I think we've been able to add that dimension.
And before I forget, if people wanted to reach out to you or to learn more about the American Free Enterprise Chamber, where should they look?
amfreechamber.com is the best starting point, and you can find several other contact resources from there.
Perfect. Thank you. That's my gratuitous plug for all of my guests, so we'll get another one there when we can. Absolutely. Small businesses are often described as the backbone of the American economy, yet many owners feel unheard or even, as you mentioned, disadvantaged.
Well, that's a great question. I think we've covered some of them with respect to the COVID era restrictions, and I think more than dwelling on the COVID era, disparities, what I would say to you, Chris, is that our feeling is generally that revealed a pattern. So I don't want to get drawn into any one particular of those, other than to say it certainly revealed that there are two sets of rules. There are rules for the biggest of the big, and there are rules for everybody else. And I think that sort of dichotomy is something that we've tried. We've tried to work on. One of the things that's emerged in recent years that I think is quite interesting is that in certain industries, I think of healthcare, for example, where one of the great problems that our small business members have is that, not unlike college tuition, every single year for multiple decades now, the cost to insure small business employees has gone up at a rate faster than inflation. And yet value has not gone up, sort of like college tuition, right? It's a very important thing in life. And it's important enough, by the way, that we all need to care about the quality of it. But its cost has gone up and up and up. But the outcomes in terms of economic advantage and ability to participate in the market and to have a fulfilling career have declined in recent years and recent decades. Healthcare is sort of the equivalent, in my view, for American small businesses. More and more and more and more expensive every year, fewer benefits, less access, more headache. And so that's really been a problem for small. It's a problem for big business as well, but we see big businesses with the ability to, number one, negotiate better rates for themselves with legacy players in the market. Number two, we've seen an increasing move among bigger businesses to self-insurance or self-insurance pools, self-insurance approaches that are generally more difficult to access for small businesses. And we see some of the very largest companies on the face of the earth who are middlemen in the healthcare business and taking more than 50 cents on the healthcare dollar. So they're not the people who are creating new cures and innovating. They're not the people who are actually providing healthcare to the end user, to the patient, to the person in need, but are financialized instruments in the middle that have taken more than 50 cents on the healthcare dollar. And so advocating along those lines, while good for the whole economy, good for big businesses too, by the way, there's a particular need for our small business membership to have some advocacy around those issues that I think without Am-Free Chamber, they don't have as fully as they should.
You mentioned before, we all know that this country was built on small businesses. Even today, it's still the backbone of the American economy. Mm-hmm. But what are some of the biggest hurdles if mom and pop want to go start a new business, whether it be a pizza parlor or a dry cleaner or a car wash? What things that are out there that are going to be some hurdles that they need to be aware of? Mm-hmm. And why is it different for them versus somebody opening up a new Walmart at the town next door?
Yeah, Chris, it's a great question, and it's one that we focus on every day. I'm going to give you a generalized answer, and then I'm happy to talk about as many of the specifics as you care to hear. The generalized answer is that overregulation is a bigger burden on small business than it is on big business. If the federal government, the state government, or the local government, for that matter, adds a new regulation, it may be a hassle, it may be a cost item for a big business, but a big business that has, a fleet of lawyers and a fleet of lobbyists and plenty of capital reserves and access to more sources of capital, they can act that regulation in a way that a small business cannot. If you're starting, Chris Meek's t-shirt shop, let's say, in Connecticut there, those regulations hit you just as hard in many important ways. And as we stack those one on another, that burden for you as a practical matter is much higher than it is for a big business. And so as a practical matter, what does that mean? I mentioned that we do a lot of legal action. One of the lawsuits that we are currently engaged in, along I think with about half of the state attorneys general, we have sued the federal government over SEC climate disclosure rules. And the reason for that is not that we want, that we want dirty air or dirty water. The reason for that is that the climate disclosure rules impact small businesses in ways that they don't impact big businesses, right? So if you have to be able to disclose the entire carbon footprint of all of your suppliers, and in fact, under the new regime, under the customers of those suppliers, that is a compliance regime that takes, many people, and I'll say expensive people that have nothing to do with making Chris Meek's t-shirt shop go. So when we put those barriers in the way of small business, we're keeping new entrants out of the marketplace, and I think dulling the vibrancy of our economy, because you don't have the competition that you might otherwise if we reduce that level of burden for America's small businesses. One example of many, by the way, and I'm not even sure it's the best one, but those are the kinds of issues that that pass with the best of intentions, and yet they have downstream consequences that make our lives more expensive, that remove new entrants to the marketplace, that make it harder for small business, as you rightly say. And I know it sounds a little cliche, but it's so true that small business is the backbone of the American economy. More raw employees work for small businesses than for big businesses. More job growth comes from small businesses than big businesses. More return on equity in small businesses than big businesses. There's more diversity, by the way, in small business. Natural diversity, not political and artificial. You have to set quotas kind of diversity. More new small businesses over the last number of years have been started by women than by men. So when you pile these regulations on in a way that makes it impossible to start a new business and be profitable at it, the downstream consequences, unintended though they may be, really are quite negative for our economy.
You've said before that politics, like business, excuse me, is ultimately about trust and brand. How does that idea translate into effective advocacy?
Well, that's a great question, and I'll be fully honest with you here and your listeners. I wish there was a better answer. There's an old saying, and I don't know whose it was, but it's always made a lot of sense to me that trust and reputation is like a barrel of rainwater. It takes a long time to fill it up, but if you tip it over, it's gone in a heartbeat. And I think one of the great challenges that we have in our politics, and I think it's true for especially for big business in America today, is that we've tipped that barrel over. As we discussed earlier in your show here, Chris, liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats will hear that a little differently. But if you look at the polling, it's very clearly true that all of us lack trust in our federal institutions. And in fact, in the post-COVID period, the only institution in American life, I think two institutions in American life that remain high trust and high confidence institutions are American veterans and American small business. Everything else is tipped over, including a lot of institutions that pre-COVID had a great deal of trust. The medical profession, for example. And I think there's a sense, rightly or wrongly, in the post-COVID years that we've not been treated as adults, as American citizens. Science moves on, we learn things, but a little bit of acknowledging our mistakes and saying we didn't get it all right, and trying to put some guardrails around making sure that doesn't happen in the future, I think would have gone a long ways to preserving some of the trust in institutions. We did not get that. We shut down free speech. We took real experts and said, you have unpopular political opinions, and therefore you can't opine on what's going on in the world. And I think that damage has not been recovered from. I wish I had a prescription for you about how to recover from it. But if you take that, barrel of rainwater metaphor, I think time is probably the best. Time with integrity, maybe. Let me add that is probably the best solution. But it's a painful solution, because in the meantime, we're all worried about how to put the country on a better track. We're all worried about how to put our families and our own lives, our own financial lives, on a better track. There are a lot of pretty ugly pressures on that. And I think the fact that we tipped that rain barrel over a few years back is really still hurting us.
Like you said, it's going to take a long time to fill that back up.
Yeah. Yep. Look at public polling numbers on how people feel about their own political party, let alone other institutions. But just in politics, um, Republicans for a number of years have not liked the Republican Party or trusted it. Democrats for a number of years have not liked or trusted the Democratic Party. Both of those parties, in very important though very different ways, are having those arguments internally right now. What is the future of the Democratic Party? What is the future of the Republican Party? But driven by loyal members of those parties that don't trust their own party. Now, the ugly truth is they dislike the other party more than they dislike their own, and so you have a sort of really ugly kind of political mix there. But even folks inside that are committed to their own party, report not trusting, not liking their own party. So this distrust matter is really, really deep, and I think it helps explain why we've seen the political volatility I described earlier in the program, Chris. The bouncing back and forth between Republican and Democratic majorities, so much more quickly than we have historically. When you feel like you've been betrayed by your own, you don't turn out next cycle, then the other side wins, even though they don't like their own party, and they mistake that win for having a mandate when in fact it was just stop screwing me over the way the other guy was, so I'm going to screw you over in a different way. That's a rhythm that I think has the country in a pretty angry spot.
You've worked with both political parties and across sectors. Do you believe the conversation around free enterprise has become too ideological? And if so, how do we bring it back to practical outcomes for people?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Chris. I don't know that it's become too ideological. I think in some ways it's become absent. And that's one of the reasons that Am Free Chamber came into existence a few years ago. That there's been a real focused conversation in the country about populism. There's been a focused conversation in the country about socialism in its various forms, democratic socialism or otherwise. In fact, just earlier this month, we swore into office on both coasts, both in New York and out west, socialist mayors. One of whom started his tenure by saying we're going to reject American individualism in favor of the warmth of collectivism. And so my view on that is that, we have something on the order of 5,000 years now, Chris, of recorded human history. So we have written records of every major culture, every major economy, every major empire that's existed over 5,000 years of the human experience. And what is so striking when you study that history is that for about 4,900 of those years, roughly speaking, the rhythm was absolutely the same. That from ancient Sumerian cuneiform records up until 1900, nearly within living memory, average global human life expectancy was 30 years old. And we were doing a little bit better in the United States. I think here in the US by 1900, the average life expectancy was in the mid 40s, but nothing like we have today. And the details varied from time to time and place to place, but by our standards today, nearly every human that ever walked the face of the earth in those first 4,900 years of recorded history lived in what you and I would think of as desperate poverty, where we lost more people at a very young age to diseases of despair and deprivation, starvation and related diseases, and the violence that comes from not having enough, and the sort of the strongman forms of government, though there are many. Let me just describe them that way, and that had yielded no change in the human condition, broadly construed globally, over 4,900 years. And then we had one single American century. And that American century defined by ideas that are common to us, and maybe to some of the next generation even now feel a little old-fashioned. And yet in the sweep of human history, they are new and radical ideas that we're all created equal, that you're endowed by your creator, that rights that government can't take away from you. And that speaking loosely, one of those rights is free access to the marketplace, that you and I in the free trade of goods and ideas and services can do a better job than some far distant government can in creating innovation and putting things in your life that you want and that you need, and creating value and maintaining that value. And what that idea, what that set of free enterprise ideas did during the American century is it lifted global human life expectancy from 30 years old, where it had been stuck consistently from ancient Sumerian, cuneiform records through 1900. It took global life expectancy in the American century from 30 up into the 70s, and not just for the wealthy. We will now lose more of our poor in America. We'll lose more of our poor to diseases of excess, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, and so forth. And not to make light of any of those. And yet what I want to say is that is the yield of free enterprise, that we are no longer losing people to diseases of deprivation at age 30 or even at age 46, as we're doing a little better in the United States by 1900. But this set of ideas has driven a global human flourishing, global shared prosperity for all of its warts and flaws and all of the problems we still have to solve. That it is the one set of ideas that has in fact proven to lead to human flourishing, and shared human flourishing at that. And I think that's a set of ideas that is not your question. I apologize, I'm answering maybe a different question, Chris. It is. Do I think that's become too ideological? No, I think it is just not as much in the conversation as socialism. It is not as much in the conversation as populism, but it needs to be, because to the extent that we do in fact share a desire to make our lives all better, to make the country's life better, the one way historically that has worked to do that is free enterprise. And that's why we feel like, reinvigorating American free enterprise is such an important mission.
Let's go back to your barrel of rainwater for a minute. Many Americans feel disconnected from institutions, government, corporations, even advocacy groups. How does AmFree work to rebuild credibility and trust with everyday business owners?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that's important not only to AmFree. I hope it's important to other organizations, including members of the Congress. I think that the simple answer is to say that there are a set of principles that are not partisan, but there are a set of principles that we know have led to human flourishing. And I think one way it's certainly, for those in politics or that are adjacent to politics and policy making and advocacy, public policy advocacy, I think one of the important lessons we've learned is that you've got to maintain fidelity to those principles if you want to maintain long-term credibility. And that to say, this principle is something we're going to advocate for today because it aligns with my party or my candidate. And I'm not going to advocate for it tomorrow because it doesn't align with my party or my candidate, is exactly how we compromise trust in the first place, and something that we strive to avoid. I'll give you an example that maybe doesn't apply directly to AmFree Chamber, but I think most Americans will get a chuckle out of, regardless of party, because both parties can be accused of the same thing. If you think about issues, for example, like Supreme Court nominations, you can literally transpose the statements of Republican and Democratic leaders in the Senate of the United States over the last 10 or 15 years, opining about how the process to either confirm or reject a new nominee to the Supreme Court should go, and doing so generally on process-oriented arguments. I think any of those arguments may be perfectly valid. When they become a compromise of trust is when I've taken one position when it's my party's nominee, and I've taken another position when it's the other party's nominee, and that's exactly the kind of thing we're trying to avoid. Our view is that free enterprise, free people in competitive markets, if you want to say it that way, that free people in competitive markets make better decisions about improving our lives than the government does. And so when it comes to assessing, are we going to support a position? Are we going to oppose a position? Are we going to be active on something? It matters not whether it is a member of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party that is making the proposal. What matters to us is it aligned with those principles that we know lead to human flourishing?
You've lectured on the future of the Republican Party, but from your vantage point, how did economic opportunity and small business policies shape the future of American politics more broadly?
Well, I think it goes back to this human flourishing point that we've discussed here on your show, Chris. I think that when we have a focus not on who's going to win the next election, but how we make our lives better, you get very quickly to the idea that we've discussed here, which is that there's one system, and really only one system, that has that has opened human flourishing, and that is American free enterprise. Now, I think it is very difficult to say that is something that one party or the other owns. I think on some issues one party is better. I think on other issues the other party has a few good points too, so I think trying to think less about who is going to be in the majority from a partisan perspective, who's going to win the next election from a partisan perspective, and think more about what does it really take to ensure that free enterprise is alive and well and growing again in America. Is sort of the pathway that we've identified. And by the way, if there's a smarter one, we'll adopt that. But I think that's the best answer we've got for you.
So you mentioned before about some of the policy and regulatory challenges if somebody wanted to start a small business would face today.
Mm-hmm.
For someone listening right now who owns a small business or dreams of starting one, what mindset shift would you encourage them to make in today's economy?
The most successful small businesses we see solve a problem that nobody else had solved yet, number one. And number two, they take courage and action. The number of people that have a great idea, and I'll say as a small business guy myself, and I know you've come from a big business background, Chris, but you've also started a couple of startups that have been really impactful. And so I'll let you correct me if I misstate this, but I think it takes a lot of courage, and to say nobody else has identified this yet, but I think I've got a little bit better idea, a better product, a better service, at a better price, and I'm going to go put that in the marketplace. It sounds easy, and it sounds you can go look at the recipe about what do great entrepreneurs and great founders have in common. A sort of an all-in focus, a dedication to the thing, and so forth. I think one of them that is rarely mentioned, but I would share with people who are contemplating it, is courage. It takes a lot of guts to do this, so that's why we think of our small business members as the real heroes in the American economy. They're not the people that have the sort of the safety of a highly capitalized publicly traded company. In many cases, they come from that world and leave some of that security behind in order to put something a little better in the marketplace. I can't tell you how much respect we have for people who will take that risk. It takes a lot of courage. And by the way, if I may just add to that, as I said earlier, one of the really exciting things we're seeing in the American culture and the American economy is that we now have more entrepreneurs in the country who are women and minorities than are old white guys. And as much as I would say that we should not enforce political and artificial quotas on those things via ESG and DEI programs that have been such a failure. The richness of authentic diversity in the economy is extraordinarily positive, and so where is that courage coming from right now? More new businesses being started by women than men, and I think that's a really powerful dynamic for the American economy.
You said a word that we don't hear too much in today's conversation. It was authentic, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, look, the economy is that. Everybody tries so hard to be authentic, and my view has always been if you're trying to be authentic, you're not. You're a little off the mark. And so one of the reasons that public policies that over-regulate with the best of intentions often fail is because it's not the authentic economy. The economy is you and I making a decision about commerce together. Of course, that happens several hundred million times over every day. But when we let it grow naturally and organically, it does very well. And we should trust the American people and trust the American economy that's been such a force for good when you unshackle it. And we've not done that. So if we want real authenticity, turn it back over to the people.
Well, I think maybe Chris Meek's t-shirt shop, the first shirt we make, will say the change you want today starts with me. So we'll keep that out there on the back burner. What role do community mentorship and advocacy play in helping business owners not just survive, but grow?
Yeah, great question. I think that, we just talked about the courage it takes to go out on your own. But of course, you go out on your own, not for your own sake, but you go out on your own to put something in the marketplace that wasn't there before, or maybe wasn't there as well as you can do it, or as efficiently as you can do it. And you need a community of supporters and of customers in many important ways to embrace that. And I think you've seen it, Chris. All of the great startups have that community around them, have a community of people who believe in them, who help them get over the hump in terms of getting started in the first place, and give them the kind of market-based feedback they need to continuously improve, and to compete. And without having a group of people around you who believe in you and believe in the mission and the vision and so forth, it won't happen. So I don't think that you can overstate the value of having that community around you.
And as someone who lives and breathes it on a daily basis, couldn't agree more with you. I got one last question for you. If policymakers were listening closely right now, and hopefully they are, what's the one principle you'd want them to keep front and center when crafting economic policy?
I hate to sound like a broken record, but I'll sound like a broken record if you'll permit it, Chris. I think that free people and competitive markets are the greatest force for human flourishing in all recorded history, and we violate that at our own peril. When Bill Clinton famously declared the era of big government over, there were about 10,000 federal regulations that had the force of law. That was just in 1996. It took the first 200 years or so of American governance to get to 10,000, and we agreed, both parties agreed in 1996 that we had too many. Today, there are more than 120,000 regulations that sit on top of the American economy. And I'll say, let's just concede that the vast majority of those, the overwhelming majority of those, were imposed with the best of intentions. And yet the economy has not grown together. That's why we're ping-ponging back and forth. We don't have a shared sense of progress, a shared sense of prosperity since the explosive growth of the regulatory state took over. That is now more than 2-decade-long period. We see it in our economy. We see it in our politics, in the divisions in our politics, the volatility and partisan outcomes, and we see it in our culture. And I think that if that one principle that we forgot, that free people and competitive markets produce better outcomes than a far distant government, boy, that's the one that defines it for me.
Gentry Collins, founder and CEO of the American Free Enterprise Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Chris, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to be with you.
No, pleasure is all mine. And thank you to our audience, which includes people in more than 50 countries, for joining us for another episode of Next Steps Forward. I'm Chris Meek. For more details on upcoming shows and guests, please follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Chris Meek Public Figure, and on X and Instagram at Chris Meek_USA. We'll be back next Tuesday for our 250th episode, so please tune in. It's a very special one. Same time, same place. We'll have another leader from the world of business, health, literature, public policy, politics, sports, or entertainment. Until then, stay safe and keep taking